your perspective.
Yeah, great TV. As the president said. Yeah, well, it's funny. So we have a 45-minute press conference, and the president normally does this, and I've seen this now 3 or 4 times with foreign leaders, where he likes to bring the media in, likes to have a conversation, but answer questions with the press. As you know, he's very open with reporters. And what I noticed is that for the first 25, 30 or so minutes, he tried to sort of bend over backwards to be gracious and kind to Zelensky, even when Zelensky was kind of needling him, even when Zelensky was saying things that I thought were untrue. The president just tried to be diplomatic, right? I think that's his natural instinct in that situation. And then when it really went off the rails, of course, is when I asked, or you had a Polish journalist who asked a question, the president answered it, and then I answered it. And then something about my answer just really set Zelensky off. So then he came at me.
So you're blaming yourself.
And then I went back at him.
Right.
And what I tried to do originally was actually try to diffuse the situation a little bit, because I'm like, we're having this meeting. Obviously, there are 100 television cameras here. Let's try to have this conversation in private. And then the president, as we kept on going back and forth, I tried again to say, well, maybe we should have this conversation in private. And the president was like, nope, actually, I don't want to have it in private anymore. I want to have this actual conversation in public for the American people to see. And I do think that there was just a certain sense of, there was a lack of respect. There was a certain sense of entitlement. And most importantly, look, we can look past all of that stuff, but the president has set a very clear goal for his administration. He wants the killing to stop. And I think that it's very important that President Zelensky and, of course, President Putin, too, they've both got to come to the negotiating table. And that's ultimately where things broke apart. I really don't care what President Zelensky says about me or anybody else, but he showed a clear unwillingness to engage in the peace process that President Trump has said is the policy of the American people and of their president. That's the real breakdown, is I think Zelensky wasn't yet there. And I think, frankly, now still isn't there. But I think he'll get there eventually. He has to.
My understanding is he tried to get back in, or tried to stay a number of times, and then made numerous calls to come back. Is that true?
I don't know about numerous calls, but they certainly made at least one request to come back in and continue the conversation. The president was like, look, first of all, they were disrespectful. And second of all, what are we even going to talk about? They've shown a clear unwillingness to discuss the peaceful settlement that President Trump is trying to bring to the situation. I think a lot of Americans are sort of, it's useful to step back and ask ourselves, what is the actual plan here? You can't just fund the war forever. The American people won't stand for it. And by the way, Sean, if you look at European opinion polls, the Europeans aren't going to stand forever for it either. We need to bring this thing to a peaceful settlement. The president was trying to do that. He'll continue to try to do that, but you've got to have two to tango. You've got to have a negotiating partner in the Ukrainians who recognize that, of course, they have their views, and of course, they're not always going to agree with us, but they've got to participate in the conversation. They weren't willing to do that on Friday, so the president said, send them home.
He said today that the war he expects will go on a very long time. I don't know where he's going to get the money to fund that war. I have my doubts that Europe will fund the war to the level that Biden and Harris were funding it. And then the issue now has come up whether or not this administration will continue to offer money and arms for this war to continue. Because without America, I would argue the president was right in saying they have no cards.
Yeah. Well, Sean, I think our European friends, frankly, are being really, they're doing a disservice to the Ukrainians, because their own populations are saying, we're not going to fund this war indefinitely. The American people are saying, we don't want to fund the war indefinitely. So the only thing that is in the best interest of America, of Russia, of Ukraine, and of Europe is to bring this thing to a close. What happened, Sean, is you have Zelensky. He goes to Europe, and a lot of our European friends puff him up. They say, you're a freedom fighter. You need to keep fighting forever. Well, fighting forever with what? With whose money, with whose ammunition, and with whose lives? The president is actually taking a much more realistic perspective and saying, this can't go on forever. We can't fund this thing forever. The Ukrainians can't fight forever. So let's bring this thing to a peaceful settlement.
When I interviewed Zelensky, he wouldn't give me direct answers. I asked him about the mineral deal to pay the U.S. back. To me, there's 3 phases in this. And my understanding was Friday was supposed to be relatively ceremonial.
It was.
And in that it was supposed to be we signed the mineral deal. That's part 1. Part 2 would be a ceasefire. Part 3 would be the hardest part, a negotiated settlement with Putin, who, correct me if I'm wrong, said he's willing to talk peace with Trump.
Yeah, he said he's willing to talk peace, and of course we trust but verify. We want to have the conversation. We don't assume that everything that anybody tells us is true. That's why we want to engage in this conversation. But you're exactly right, Sean. When the Ukrainians came to Washington on Friday, it was supposed to be ceremonial. You know, there had been some public back and forth, some disagreements, some words spoken in public, and the president was like, let's have this moment. We give some credit to the brave Ukrainian fighters, and of course, it's a very brave army that they have there in Ukraine. Let's sign this minerals deal, which importantly does two things. It allows the American people to get some of their money back, but it also shows the Ukrainian people that America has a long-term investment in their sovereignty. You do those things, we'll sign this thing, we'll have a rah-rah moment, and then we'll get to the tough talk of negotiating peace. We couldn't even get the Ukrainians to a point where they could talk about the peaceful settlement. And look, in some ways, Sean, I get it. I get the frustration. I get the rage. It's their country. Of course, it's not our country, but you've got to accept, cooler heads have got to prevail. This thing cannot go on forever. This is the important point. I'd say this too, are of course, most importantly, the Americans who are watching, but people all over the world. When you talk to leaders in private, whether they're Ukrainian or European, when you talk to people in private, they will tell you this cannot go on forever. There aren't enough Ukrainian lives, there isn't enough American money, and there isn't enough ammunition to fund this thing indefinitely. The only realistic pathway to bringing this thing to a settlement is President Trump's pathway. We encourage both President Zelensky and President Putin to follow that path.
Well, I mean, hundreds of billions of dollars have been spent, and this came up in the discussion Friday. The Biden administration called Putin every name in the book, and they've been trying to get the president.
And he still invaded anyway.
Okay, he still invaded anyway. Well, remember, it depends if it's a minor incursion. Let's go back to that moment, which I thought, as troops were amassing on the border.